Hello everyone, and welcome to a brand new theory and speculation video. Today, I wanted to talk about some of my ideas regarding Fontaine's second weekly boss. I did videos similar to this one for both Inazuma and Sumeru, so it feels right to continue the trend. Now, this video does contain spoilers for the quests listed on screen now, so if you haven't done those, you have been warned. With all that said though, let's get right into the video. I'd like to start off with an idea that I've actually discussed before. In my recent video on Arlecchino and the history of the Knave, I talked about how there was another Knave before the one we met in Fontaine. The previous Knave was attacked by a certain child at the House of the Hearth, who went on to replace her. Of course, this child would be the Arlecchino we know today. Now, in that video, I mentioned that Arlecchino was described to be a child at the time, and how she seemingly aged so quickly. However, it was pointed out to me that orphans at the House of the Hearth can still be referred to as children, no matter their age. Anyways, after the fight between the Knaves, the fate of the previous Knave has been left open-ended. If she is still alive and out there somewhere, it would make sense that she would want revenge against the current Knave. She could be plotting in the shadows, working on a plan to take Arlecchino down. In my Arlecchino video, I speculated that she may have been working with a segment of Dottore on her plan. However, this segment would have been destroyed by Omega Build Dottore during the Sumeru Archon quests, leaving the previous Knave to have to work alone once again. Eventually though, the previous Knave would either make her move against Arlecchino, or Arlecchino would learn about her plans and try to stop her. Either of these scenarios could happen in Arlecchino's story quest if she becomes playable. Since she views us as an ally rather than an enemy, she may enlist our help to fight against the previous Knave. Helping her out here would also strengthen her trust in us, which could then further help our relation with the Fatui and future Archon quests. Out of all the ideas I have for this video, this one makes the most sense to me. Plus, it would be really cool to see two Harbingers fight one another. If you want to hear more of my in-depth thoughts on this concept, check out my recent Arlecchino video. Moving on to the next weekly boss idea, I'd like to talk about the God King of Remuria, Remus. For those who don't know, Remuria was a prosperous civilization in Fontaine that existed just prior to Agiria's Fontaine. I actually did make a whole video about Remuria recently, where I go a bit more in depth with its lore. Unfortunately for Remus and his people though, this nation didn't last long and had a pretty tragic downfall. During his reign, Remus ordered that all of the Lockfolk and Viships shall be hunted down. Of course, they didn't like that, and so a group of Viships and barbarians rebelled against Remus under the leadership of the dragon Scylla. Eventually, this all spiraled down into Remuria falling down into the abyss. Despite Remus's best efforts to try and salvage his kingdom, it was too late and he fell into the abyss along with his people. Much like the previous Knave though, his fate has been left unclear, as we don't know if he survived in the abyss or not. Looking at the lore from the weapon's Song of Stillness, we know that some Remurians did survive, eventually making peace with the Viships after years of fighting. So, if the Remurians could survive for years in the abyss, why couldn't Remus? After all, he was a god king born from the primordial sea, described as having unsurpassed authority. With power like that, it wouldn't make sense for the Abyss to win so easily against him. If Remuria gets added to the game, we could travel into the Abyssal Ruins and perhaps even meet Remus himself. As for the story quest that would lead us down here, I think a second act to Nouvelette's story quest would fit. After all, Nouvelette may have ties to Scylla, the dragon who led a rebellion against Remus. While this hasn't been confirmed, it is possible that Scylla was the previous Hydros sovereign. If this ends up being the case, Nouvelette may be able to sense that something has changed in Remuria, enlisting our help in finding out what's going on. After traveling through this new area for a bit, the quest would culminate in an encounter and fight with Remus. At this point, Remus could be even more powerful than he was before by accepting the powers of the Abyss. Then again, 2 Abyssal Weeklies in one nation may be too much. if we do meet Remus, it may fit better as a part of an Archon quest with Dainsleif. Turning the last idea on its head, instead of another Abyssal Weekly, why not a Celestial Weekly? Of course, I don't expect a full-on fight with Celestia yet, but instead someone connected to them. In Fontaine's lore, we have learned a bit more about one of the 4 shades of the Primordial One, specifically the Shade of Life. We are told from the lore in the Wings of Merciful Wrathful Waters that after the removal of the Dragon of Water from the Primordial Sea, the Shade of Life created Egeria to act as the Primordial Sea's new heart. Now, I don't think we would fight the Shade of Life herself, but rather a part of her. In my video about Istaroth, the Shade of Time, I mentioned the idea of shades having multiple instances or pieces of themselves all around Teyvat. Essentially, these instances would be fragments of the Shade, sort of like their children in a way. While the Shade of Time has the 1,000 Winds, the Shade of Life could have something relating to water. Speaking of water, I had theorized that Nabu Malikata was related to Istaroth, but now I think it's more likely that she's related to the Shade of Life. We were told that when Nabu Malikata wandered the barren wastes for 72 days, springs gushed from her wounds. Nilou, who dresses like Nabu Malikata, also possesses a hydrovision. Getting back on track though, I believe we could face an instance of the Shade of Life, which would fit in a second act to either Furina or Nouvelette's story quests. For Furina, this quest would involve her facing her past and the consequences that will result from the actions of both Egeria and Focalors. Perhaps long ago, the Shade of Life created a backup heart for the Primordial Sea in the event of the Hydro Archon passing away with no one to replace her. With the death of Focalors, this instance may have awoken. Of course, since Nouvelette has the power of the Hydro Archon now, this instance would see him as a threat. They may try to steal Nouvelette's power once again, which would make this weekly boss also fit as part of Nouvelette's second story quest. While I do like this idea and think it would be cool to see, I think that something like this will probably be saved for later in the story. Right now, we don't even know if the shades are active, but it's still a fun idea to think about. Speaking of fun ideas, these final few candidates are ones that are a bit more unlikely, but I still wanted to mention them for the fun of it. First up, we have none other than Child's Master Skirk. While at first this idea seems a bit out there, especially since Skirk wasn't hostile towards us and even gave us some important information, there are a few things that could make this work. Perhaps she will learn more behind the truth of the Gnosis, just like she said she would. Instead of giving us this information outright, however, she would challenge us to a fight to see if we are still worthy of her respect and information. This could also happen in a second act of Nouvelette's story quest, or maybe even a second act of Tartaglia's story quest. Then again, this would be another Abyssal Weekly, which I already said would probably be too much for one nation. Additionally, it will probably be a while before we see her again. At the earliest, she could appear in Fontaine's Dainsleif Archon quest, or maybe even in Natlan, which I'll be talking about in a video later this week. Moving on though, these next two ideas would both fit in with Arlecchino's story quest. The first of these would be a fight against the second of the Fatui Harbingers, Il Dottore. I theorized earlier that he could have some role in the Previous Knave's plans. Instead of fighting her, we could end up fighting some newly created Dottore segments. As cool as this would be, I think it is quite unlikely for a few reasons. We don't know how long it takes Dottore to make new segments of himself, and I doubt he would send a new one to help the Previous Knave so soon. Also, he tends to have others fight for him rather than fighting himself, and even takes measures to avoid conflict altogether. With all of that said, it would seem more likely for any Dottore segment to leave the fighting to the Previous Knave. As for my last idea, that would be the seventh of the Fatui Harbingers, Sandrone. She already has ties to Fontaine, as seen in the World Quest series Questioning Melusine and Answering Machine. It is heavily implied that she is the Harbinger mentioned in this quest series, as she does have an interest in machines. She also apologizes to us via a note, which would be out of character for Dottore, the other Harbinger interested in machines. In an alternate version of Arlecchino's story quest, she could end up as the weekly boss. Even if she is featured in Arlecchino's story quest though, I think a fight against her would be unlikely. She is the 7th of the Harbingers, meaning it would be an easier fight than Scaramouche, who was 6th. She also seemingly doesn't want to make an enemy out of us, given her apology that I mentioned earlier. With all that said, those are some of my ideas for the second weekly boss of Fontaine. Out of all the candidates I mentioned today, I still think the Previous Knave is the most likely, with Remus in a close second. If you want to know more about some of the topics I mentioned in this video, I recommend my videos on Arlecchino, Remuria, and Istaroth. I also do want to make videos on the Shade of Life and the individual Harbingers, so stay tuned for those. I would love to hear what ideas you guys have for Fontaine's second weekly boss in the comments below as well. Anyways, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Sources and further readings are also in the description if you want to check them out. I hope you all have an amazing day, and I'll see you all in the next video.